I don't know if anybody timed that.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, I'm going to exercise my privilege and ask you a few questions. Let's start with something really simple. Why should people trust the internet?
I mean, I don't think people should. I mean, I don't think most people trust any kind of like medium per se. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who probably don't trust what they read in the New York Post some days. And so I think, I think like as with print, like you develop relationships with brands and with voices, and increasingly now with individuals rather than with institutions, just because the internet is organized around these individual voices more. And credibility is kind of won and lost on a daily basis, and it's incredibly important both to get things right, and then if you screw up, to be really transparent about it, because you are trust is the coin of the realm.
You used the word ecosystems a couple of times, and I heard it used, in the summertime in a speech given by the head of AOL. But it felt in a much scarier context, because he said what we're going to be seeing is closed ecosystems. In other words, the Yahoos and the Googles and the whoever's of the world are going to try to lock down their audience and prevent access to independents like BuzzFeed or whatever. I mean, I'm fast forwarding his sentence, but I'm asking you, what was he really saying? And what is an ecosystem in the sense you're talking about?
God, that sounds like a terrible buzzword. I didn't even realize I was using it. I think what I mean is just that Americans, but people globally, just spend an enormous amount of their time on Facebook. People now spend more time on the internet than they do watching TV, which is a lot of time, often concurrently. And so for news, the space in which our stories are traveling around is to some degree the front page of our website, but is more people's Facebook feeds, people's Twitter feeds. I don't know if folks are on Pinterest, but a lot of people spend a lot of time on Pinterest. And I think, our experience has not been that they're trying to kind of wall themselves off and capture people. I think they've kind of built the tracks, but they aren't at the moment interested in building and owning trains. And so, you could imagine Facebook saying, we're going to build a news organization and only our news is going to be on Facebook. But I don't know, it's a hard thing to do, and they know that, and they'd rather have lots of different companies competing to make the best stuff for their readers. So and that's sort of the opposite of a closed system. They're these different, almost these companies that are running what are now the new cable wires and broadcast pipes are competing and trying to sort of encourage publishers to make things for their readers.
50 years ago, editors had just a few gauges of interest, newsstand sales being one of them. How different is it for you? How do you make editorial decisions with the business in mind? What data do you see? Again, I'm violating my rule of asking one question at a time. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess we look a lot at traffic. But which is not a word I love, just because it just means human beings who are reading your story, which is what all of us wanted in the first place. But I think we're very realistic about, the notion that the audience for 33 Cats who are disappointed in you is like somewhat larger than the audience for what's the latest in Syria. But I think, you try to develop a sense of how big is the possible audience for a story about Syria. Maybe it's 100,000 people, but you certainly want to hit all 100,000 of them, and you want to do a story that'll be compelling and that they'll share, not write a story that you think is great and that 10 people read.
Since you spent more time than anybody else in the room thinking about cats and news, have you done the 10 most endangered cats in Syria feature yet?
Like one of the really weirdest and most disturbing things happening, or not, maybe it's not particularly disturbing, but a lot of the jihadi fighters in Syria are very active on Instagram, and now there's a thing of them taking pictures wearing their masks and carrying their guns holding cats. Totally not a joke. We wrote about one of these guys. Instagram then threw him off Instagram, and then he like wrote some angry thing about how BuzzFeed had gotten him thrown off Instagram. This is some Syrian jihadi. Did you have a... Oh, sorry, I don't mean to...
No, now it's time to take questions from the crowd. Barbara? Do we have a...
I can repeat the question.
Do we have a mic?
Go
Go ahead. We'll repeat it. Shout.
I run a very small website using various Syrian students about New York City women. And we have tiny traffic compared to what you do, but I do understand some elements of the web. Here's two questions. I recently read the article in New York Magazine about BuzzFeed, and to the extent I understand it, one of the issues they brought up that was bothering me was the way in which you tend to monetize news by use word like an advertorial. You kind of, and I wanted to know if and that upset me because I like to think that there's news and there's ads, and I've written advertorials and I know the difference, but it just didn't seem to be that everything you did was one big advertorial.
Can I answer that question? It was a question about our advertising, which there's like gets called sponsored content or native ads, and is a kind of thing that everybody is sort of getting into at the moment, but that we've been doing longer than others. I mean, I think the basic theory, before I got to BuzzFeed, was just that banner ads on the internet are kind of disliked by consumers, and so they get increasingly aggressive and they drop over your screen, and you have to find this little X to make them close, and nobody likes that. And that there's this alternate tradition of advertising that people like, which is, I mean, women's magazines in a way are the best example, just in that like if you cut all the ads out of Vogue, people would like the magazine less. They're really well produced. They're of a kind of content that the readers of Vogue like. But also, I think there's also some confusion, but like we have a very, very traditional separation between folks who work with advertisers and make ads, in a creative department, and the editorial side. Like those guys don't report to me. I don't know what they're doing. I don't know who our advertisers are most of the time. Although advertisers, as I was just telling Stephen, do call me and scream at me sometimes. That is a very traditional relationship with advertisers. So I think it's and then the advertisements they produce, they come with an overlay of yellow, the way an ad on Google does, and they say they're sponsored, and they have the brand's name. But they're of as in women's magazines, they're of a kind of genre of content that people like. Less written out advertorials, more like 15 great hybrid animals that will make you think of your hybrid car or something. But they're clearly labeled. So, I mean, I actually really, as a reporter, I would much prefer, when I was at Politico once, the government of Kazakhstan sponsored like one of those big takeovers of my blog, and so it was all pictures of President Nursultan Nazarbayev everywhere, which I don't know, to me, like, I did not love. And so as a reporter, it's, to me, preferable that you have ads on your site that your readers know are ads, but also like. Sorry, the sound is back. Yeah, I think you misunderstood it. It sounded like we were homogenizing things. Yeah, that's not how we see. That's not how we see it. How much of it is original and how much is picked up / aggregated? I mean, I guess I think of it almost all as original. Like, we don't really do rewrite. We don't do, usually if somebody else breaks a story, we don't do the sort of more traditional AP or, New York Times thing of rewriting it and crediting, because we figure, you know what, people have seen that story on Twitter, so we're going to try to advance it. That said, there's a genre of like web content that is all about mixing and remixing photos, and so like the 33 cat, you know, if we do a post of the like 100 most important cats of the year, like there'll probably be cats that have already circulated elsewhere and, you know, been appreciated that way. But I don't know, I actually think like, yeah, so we do a ton of original content. We also, and then if there's a huge story that isn't, you know, that isn't something we broke, we'll certainly cover it and aggregate it.
Please stand up, just so we can.
Get up and talk.
Yeah.
Good loud voice. Years of press conference. I picked up the New York Times today and come to my door, and there was actually a piece of news. And I was curious. It was about a judge who, and I'm sure you saw it yourself, a judge that said the NSA was overstepping its bounds. I'm sure everybody thinks so. And I was curious, because I don't look at BuzzFeed very often. I went on your website. I found a lot of things about you.
1, 2.
What do you do when you're not married?
Sir? Sir?
I couldn't find any mention, including comment, thank you. I couldn't find any mention, any comment about, comment would have been fine about this story. Now, what's news?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I actually...
That's a real event there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure...
If you don't think so, then we're all from the wrong business.
Oh, for sure. And I think, you know, sometimes the challenge on the web is that if you don't have something to add to a story that your readers have already seen, there's a question of whether you do it. I mean, you, in fact, were familiar with that story. But we in fact write a ton about the NSA stuff. We had a story, I think, about Edward Snowden's letter to the people of Brazil, which was also an important thing leading the site this morning. Right, that was today's news. That was what was leading our site this morning.
I wish to hell that my old magazine had made him the person of the year rather than
Yeah.
I think he probably was.
For sure. So, for instance, leading the news that led our site today was his attempt to seek asylum in Brazil, which to me was a news story. So, you know, we do cover a lot of news. I think basically, though, the front page, this is a change in the web, is that the front page of the website, if you're obsessed with news, you're likely, or our readers who are obsessed with news are on Twitter in this mess of news, and we sort of expect them to find our stories there and push our stories there harder to them. But we do. I don't know. We try to break news. We did, I thought, a great profile of the Judge Walton, who runs the FISA court, the other day.
I'm talking about today's news, that's all.
But you were aware of it, so you didn't need to find it on BuzzFeed.
I'd like to have seen how you covered it, what your take on it was, what your readers' take on it was. There was nothing that I could find.
Well, I'm glad you were able to see it in the Times, then.
Then why should I bother with you?
Would you give Jerry the microphone? You still have the mic? Where's the mic?
Sorry.
Yeah, hi. As you can imagine, can you hear me? As you can imagine, most of us here grew up with newspapers or worked for newspapers. Don't let this gray hair fool you. And the business that we grew up with, we had a copy editor at the New York Times. We had a standards editor. And I'm ignorant of how, since you're almost reinventing the wheel in terms of getting stuff out so quickly, what do you have in terms of standards and fact-checking and things like that? Is it comparable to newspapers, or is it a different way of doing business?
Yeah, I kind of come out of a newspaper culture, basically. So we don't have like magazine-style fact-checking, like we expect reporters to get stuff right. But we have, we've got a copy desk with, I think, maybe 4 copy editors at the moment. And the nice thing about the current environment is that if you have a typo, some very polite people on Twitter will very quickly bring it to your attention, which we're very grateful for. But so in some ways it's similar. I mean, we try to get things right and be fast and have the copy be clean. And one difference is that when it's not perfect, you actually do get to reel it in and fix it immediately. And I think that does change the dynamic around corrections and stuff. The thing doesn't just leave and misinform people forever. You can fully reel it in. But,
May we pass the microphone over here, please? Just pass it across the room, Jerry.
Do you think of yourself as a news organization or as a kind of provocative entertainment organization?
do we think of ourselves as a
His
news...
main goal is to move numbers.
Do we think of ourselves as a news organization or as sort of an entertainment company whose main goal is to move numbers?
Yeah,
I mean, I think we
kind
see
of
I think we
entertainment
see
company.
ourselves as a news and entertainment company. I mean, maybe a little more like NBC than like NBC News. You know what I mean? I mean, I think we do stuff that is pretty clearly entertainment, and also stuff
But
that's
do you
totally
have an
hard
agenda?
news.
Do you have an agenda?
No, I think we come more politically speaking. I think we come pretty much out of the like mainstream American newspaper tradition of trying to get things right, being neutral.
Even though, as described by you earlier, part of your process is to do provocative things to get other people to talk about you. So,
I mean, the New York Times had this incredibly powerful and provocative series on its front page about this girl in Fort Greene. I think
no,
I think
that's
everybody
true,
tries to do
But
that.
they don't do it with the sole purpose of getting other people to get into a fight with you to get more eyeballs. and
Yeah, that's probably more the political. I mean, I see what you mean. No,
Yeah, because that's what I see a lot on the internet, because there's a whole science to being provocative, and I've done it, of course, for many years in the publishing business.
Yeah, I feel like
Being
this is not totally
provocative-
new to the newspaper industry, being provocative.
But just for the sole purpose of being provocative. We're not seeking the truth, we're seeking eyeballs or readers or numbers.
I mean, I think we've all
Right.
always tried to do both, right? I mean, I don't know any newspapers that weren't interested in readers, but also I don't know anybody who didn't want to get it right.
But supposedly, with some newspapers, aside from the New York Post and some of the others, the agenda was, at least the spoken agenda was to seek the truth and tell the truth, right?
Yeah, I
to
mean, that's-
report what was actually happening. But on the internet, more and more and more, you see organizations whose agenda is basically to feed the monster and to be provocative and to create stories for the sole purpose of generating numbers. That's it. So if your agenda, and I could sit down today and think of 1,000 ways to get millions of people to go to my website, right? And if that was my agenda, I could do that. If my agenda was to actually properly report things that are happening, I'd have fewer
Yeah, I guess
readers.
I feel like these incentives aren't that different. I mean, because credibility is just so totally the coin of the realm, as it always has been, and you have to get things right, and you have to have people trust that you're right, and so.
Do you feel that you have that?
Yeah, I think we do with our readers for sure.
Okay.
Behind you, Judith.
You mentioned that you have someone in Syria, somebody in Africa, that you're going to hire 6 new people. Are you going to pay them a living wage that they can live on?
Yeah, it's actually like a very competitive moment for reporters because I don't know, I spent this morning in a bidding war with Glenn Greenwald's new organization over a 22-year-old who will definitely get a living wage. But yeah, no, we poached the Syria guy from Newsweek where he was, yeah, and yes, you have to pay. And in fact, it's actually such a competitive moment because each story is competing with every other story out on the internet that the difference between the best reporter and the guy and the third person is sort of exaggerated. And I think this, I mean, in my like limited experience, I think a lot of reporters are getting paid more than they were.
Can you give us a figure on what you're paying that person in Syria?
I feel like Mike would be uncomfortable if I gave you his salary. But I don't know, we're paying him a little more than Newsweek was.
Oh, that's not very good. What? Yeah.
He got in before like the bad old days. And he got in at the right time at Newsweek. So he's okay.
What you're saying, just not to belabor it,
Yeah.
you're saying that your people can work for you and support a family and make a career out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've only been around for 2 years, and one of the things that we're now spending a lot of time thinking about is, if a young reporter has been like killing it for a couple of years, they don't want to necessarily do the same thing. And how do you give people a career path? But yeah, no, I mean, there's nobody making as little as I was, even adjusted for inflation, as little as I was making at my first reporting job in the city.
Let's pass the mic up. Pass it to Bill and then. All right, we're good.
While that's passing, you've got 4 copy editors.
Yeah.
You're paying them as well as you're paying your hot shots?
No. Is that traditional to pay the copy editors as much as you pay the hotshots?
This may sound like a silly question. Do you have a cat yourself?
I'm a dog person, 2
All
dogs.
right. The reason I say this is I'm the person, sorry folks, I'm the person who puts the cats on the internet and passes on all the cat sites. Until you were invited to speak at this luncheon, I had no idea there was any news content at all in BuzzFeed. How
Excellent.
do you find it?
Well, this is actually something about, no, but this is like a very basic thing about the way the internet is organized now, is that if all you want to see is cats, all you're going to see is cats. If all you want to see is Syria, you live on Twitter and only read about Syria. So there are people who are obsessed with politics who I know who have some vague sense that BuzzFeed also does cats, but who think of it really as a political site. And so there's this kind of blind man and the elephant quality to the internet, because if you're on Facebook, if you're on Twitter, you've chosen where you're getting your information. And so you're then getting, I don't know, so you see parts of things. And actually, for news organizations, it's sort of an interesting question of like, what's your front page now?
First of all, point of information. I know you pay at least some people a living wage, because the guy you stole from us, you have to be paying a very living wage to. But secondly, in hiring a great journalist like Mark Schoofs to recruit 6 people to do investigative reporting, my question is sort of the business decision there. You know, you have these huge numbers. Is this going to add to your numbers? In other words, what is the strategy that caused you to make this, for you, a fairly large investment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the media, I mean, I don't know. The media business is, I guess, a bit of a mysterious thing to me. But traffic is actually sort of overrated. We don't sell, we don't have advertisements that run adjacent to our stories. So we don't actually make money in a direct way from traffic. And, you know, when we want to build the sort of news organization that people want to want to sort of come to and want to trust. And I think it's just, you know, to do that, you need to build these muscles, you know, that involve, you know, when you dig into something and find out there's more, being able to really swing for the fences and go for a huge story. And if you want to, you know, keep and grow great young reporters, you need to have reporters like Mark who can teach them to be better. And so, I mean, it just seems like you can't, I don't know, if you want to build a really strong across-the-boards news organization, you don't really have an option of saying, oh, we won't, you know, we're just going to like kind of stop here.
So we have more questions from the audience, which I'll get to in a second, but I want to follow up on Paul's question. You might cheer up the entire room if you can tell us how you actually foresee making money covering real news.
I mean, we are covering real news, and but I mean, basically by selling ads. I mean, this is a very traditional thing. I mean, and it's probably true that, you know, that at some point more people were reading about Marilyn Monroe than John F. Kennedy. I mean, there are certainly some subjects that have always had more readers than others. That was a good story, right?
Basically, it's a simple question. Maybe not. After the newspapers are gone, and the magazines are gone, and the books are gone, and the internet settles down, how will people actually communicate? Do you have any ideas about that? I mean, these websites, basically, BuzzFeed is another newspaper. It just doesn't print. But how will people actually they communicate?
I mean, the thing that we notice that I'm sure you guys notice is people just spend an enormous amount of time on their mobile devices. Like, more than about half of our audience now, including Alan. This is basically a model of about half of our audience right here. Are reading it on their phones, and I think there's only going to be more of that. We do a fair amount of video, and the prime time for watching videos is on your mobile phone at like 9 p.m. because you're also watching TV, but it's a commercial or it's boring, and so you're watching a video too. So yeah, I'm not totally sure, but it'll definitely be on some kind of mobile gadget.
Would you ever charge for content?
Would we charge for content? No. If what you want is to get content to spread, the worst thing you can do is charge for it.
Ben, I cover entertainment news at ABC News Radio. The biggest story these days in entertainment is Beyonce, and it caught everyone by surprise. What's your take on this? Suddenly, the music industry is saying, "What the hell is going on? What have we done wrong?"
There is something about the news cycle. I actually first heard this from the White House communications director, Dan Pfeiffer, that like surprises are the only thing that work now. Like if you say to the White House press corps, in his case, the president's got a big announcement coming in 10 minutes, everybody assemble. Like by the time the announcement comes, everybody's bored of it already, and they've been tweeting about it, and they've raised expectations. So the only way for them to break big news is to have Obama just walk into the press room. Everybody's like diving for their cameras, and I think and it just sort of explodes as and so I think that's sort of the same dynamic Beyonce took advantage of. Just that it's sort of this moment that privileges surprises.
Were you surprised?
I was definitely surprised. Fortunately, like half my staff stayed up all night writing about it. So.
Behind you, Bill. Give the mic behind you.
So at one point in your remarks, you pointed out that there was a point in time where Twitter replaced long-form blogs as a prime source of news. And I'm curious, there was a story in The Atlantic, I think it was last year, is Google making us stupid? The premise of which was that people are losing their capacity to read long-form journalism because all they read these days is short-form journalism. And if the trend of news is away from blogs to Twitter, which is in effect a postcard, is there a long-term impact on our ability to absorb real news?
Yeah, I don't. There's always been. I mean, at least certainly as long as I've been doing this for like 15 years, there's always been this line that people's attention spans are declining. And I guess that's just not really our experience. Like what Twitter mostly is here is a link to this great story. And you click out and it's a story that's a lot longer than 140. That's basically like, that's what Twitter is composed of. And so, we are doing more and more really long stuff and finding, and what we find is that, a deeply, deeply reported 5,000 word story does a lot better than a 800, like that people love, like a one-line joke does great, a quick video, something that's short and quick does great, and then like there's this kind of valley of death down to like the 1,000-word-long day story that really nobody wants. Like here's stuff you already knew, but we kind of repackaged it, but then you do sort of come out the other side, and big features, do really well. We published this extremely long story, like probably 6,000 or 7,000 words on a Mexican freak show icon of the 19th century whose body had been the subject of a complicated legal dispute that had 500,000 people read it. So, yeah, I mean, there's definitely an audience for that stuff, and we can also see, which is neat, what share of the readers go to the end, like where people click off the page, and 15-20% will read to the end of a really long article, which is, I think, to me, like pretty good. If you can tell your writer, yeah, 40,000 people read this thing to the end, like that's pretty cool.
Ray, over here.
I'm just curious.
Wait, Linda, wait till you get the mic, please.
A hypothetical, but how would you have covered 9/11?
How would we have covered it?
A breaking news story of that magnitude.
I mean, I think. Can I repeat your 9/11 story?
Sure, go ahead.
It's really interesting because Alan and I were talking. Alan was at CNN on 9/11, and he, well, you can correct me if I get it wrong, but he at some point ducked into a storefront and heard a bang, and he was on air, and he said, "Oh God, was that another explosion?" And then he stepped out, and he realized it wasn't. It was a truck going by, but he was already off air by then. Wasn't a chance to correct it, and that third explosion has now become like a core part of 9/11 conspiracy literature, that CNN at some point reported another explosion and then covered it up. So I think like for insane, chaotic, massive story, I mean, the closest thing we had was the Boston bombing. You try to find everything you can find, and you try to be extremely transparent with readers about what you know and what you don't know, and what and that's, I mean, in those situations, to me, like that's the huge challenge. And another thing that's really different is that 5 years ago, if somebody like Dzhokhar Tsarnaev like pops into the news, you'll Google him, and you'll get like maybe his address and maybe like a website he once made and a little bit of stuff. But now now people live their whole lives on the internet, and you'll find masses of information and videos of them and their whole life story on Twitter and Facebook, and just way more information, particularly about like a 25-year-old, and in real information, not just traces. And so if you have reporters who are both very good reporters and very fluent in that medium, and in that case, fluent in Russian, like there's just a ton that you can report, real reporting you can do online, as well as, of course, sending reporters to Boston and trying to find his friends.
I got the mic, so. What do you think is going to come out of the Washington Post now under Jeff Bezos, and what advice would you give to the New York Times?
I don't think I'm not in a position to give advice to the New York Times. I'm going to pass on that one. But I mean, I don't know. It's interesting that because Bezos, right, he could have spent $250 million and started a new thing. Like you could get a long way with $250 million, and instead chose to buy the Post. And I mean, so far, really, the change has just been that like they have a kind of confidence and spring in their step and ability to hire people that they haven't had in several years. Like there was a young reporter who I was trying to hire a couple years ago who had an interview with the Washington Post, and she was like a 24-year-old, and she came out just like, this place is chaos, they're so demoralized, and instead took a job at the Tampa Tribune. And there was a sense that the Post was just like, people was doomed. And now I think people there are very, feel excited to be there. Marty Baron has obviously given them a lot of energy. It's not clear to me, like, in any technical sense, what they're doing differently, but it's definitely been good for morale.
Let me interject here. So you were in a bidding war recently, though, not with the Washington Post, but with the new Glenn Greenwald, Pierre Omidyar startup. Yeah. What does that say? And when does Twitter get eclipsed by something else, and what will it be?
Yeah, I do think there are these new players all over. I mean, it's an interesting. I mean, it's a moment when. And I think, probably you see this at CUNY, like young reporters have a lot of options. I mean, there are these new organizations. There's this thing, Vocative, that's trying to do things I don't entirely understand around data. There's Glenn Greenwald's sort of independent, left-wing, extremely well-funded, not quite sure what it is yet. But, we are certainly, running across these other organizations as we try to hire people. And there's just, yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I think it's kind of a good moment to be getting into the business. And then there's the other really interesting question, right, is that for us, our distribution pipes are Twitter and Facebook and Pinterest, Reddit, email, but, are things that we don't own or control. And so, what if they go away and what replaces them? I mean, I think our view is that people are going to want news, are going to be sharing it, are going to want to, I mean, it's not, and then, whether these specific companies become, the plumbing of the internet, whether they become the wire, the cables that run in the ground, or whether they're more like, Friendster or something that came and went, is sort of an open question. I mean, it feels to me like Twitter and Facebook are the plumbing, are things that are the graphs of people's relationships they have, and the extent to which they're embedded in people's lives does feel very deep. At the same time, there are these new, Snapchat. Is this interesting service where you share an image, but there's no link. There's no way to share news. It's just an image and it vanishes. We just started embedding you can now share our stories on a service called WhatsApp very easily, which is a messaging service that is very popular internationally, less so here. But yeah, I mean, we're always kind of keeping an eye out for the next one of those. Question in back? Last question?
Somebody else have a question?
I think, is this the last question?
Wait, Kate, get the mic, please. Get the mic. Well, while we're getting the mic, tell us what you're looking for in young reporters. How do you have time to read their stories, and where do you read them?
I don't know. I mostly like pure aggression.
It's pretty clear that we're not going backwards ever again. So where do you think we are in terms of maturity in this new world that we are existing in with news?
Yeah, that's in terms of maturity. I mean, I think maybe adolescence. I mean, for us, certainly last year, there was this sense that we would break some news or do a good story, and everybody would applaud us like we were this baby that had taken its first steps. Oh, so great, for doing kind of basic stuff. And now I think people look at us and look at some other online outlets and are like, okay, this is this is an adolescent who is large and strong and can carry things and walk on its own, and but still has some rough edges and makes some mistakes, and isn't kind of fully formed. I don't know. But I think we certainly feel like we're kind of growing up.
Unless somebody has an absolutely burning question, I guess Gary Paul Gates does. Go ahead.
Very brief.
Wait, give him the mic. Give him a mic. He's a broadcaster. He's still. You need a mic.
Following up on your question, now I'd like to ask Ben, what are you looking for in
Yeah, I mean, I think and we hire. We do not hire only children. People who are going to get scoops and be really aggressive. I mean, that to me, like, having now hired a bunch of people and figured out what works and what doesn't, it does seem like aggressiveness is a very important personal quality. I mean, yeah, absolutely. There's no shortage.
Ben, thank you very much. You really enlightened us about BuzzFeed, about the new world of news. It's great to have you here. Please be on deck on January 14th, and maybe, Ben probably doesn't have 2 hours to take off, but it would be interesting to hear the relationship between the press and the prosecution from Preet Bharara, the U.S. Attorney, who will surprise you because it turns out he's the only prosecutor I've met who can really deliver, without fail, a punchline. He's very funny, and he's really smart.
We once did a list of his jokes.
And Ben says if you want to Google it, maybe we'll Google it and put it on the Silurians website with a link, that BuzzFeed did a list of Preet Bharara's jokes. How about?
He's like obsessed with BuzzFeed.